Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to Calgary Barbell. It is Friday and we're gonna do Form Check Friday, believe it or not, like we do every Friday. Diving right into it, our first submission comes from a guy named Diego, and he's from Spain. So he's got some squats here, and a couple of things I've noticed with his squats is the first thing is his setup. His elbows are a little bit higher than I think is going to be beneficial for him. I think if you can get those elbows down a little bit, it's going to help you tighten your back a little bit, stay a little bit more upright out of the hole, because that's one of the biggest things we're seeing is a loss of tension in the hole. So aside from doing some pause squats and some pin squats and some things like that, maybe even tempo squats to try and get you a little bit more comfortable in the hole, another thing we can do is just kind of slow that descent. Try to be a little bit more controlled, a little bit tighter as you hit the bottom point. As well, just thinking a little bit more about the activation and the tension in your upper back can help a lot, but that's probably most of it there. So Diego, I hope that advice helps a little bit, and let's work with some of those supplementary movements as well in your training. Jared Jennings is our next form check. He's doing some deadlifts here. He says he's 6'2" and has been struggling to try and find a technique and some things that work for him. So it looks like, to me, it looks like Jared is a little bit out in front of the bar still. It looks like he's having trouble getting his torso into position without sitting down too far behind the bar, because he does have a pretty long torso. So one thing that I might suggest, Jared, is I might try widening things up. So I might try going with a bit of a wider stance and a bit of a wider grip in order to be able to sort of pull yourself back over the bar a little bit. Because the biggest thing we need is your torso's here. If my fingertip is your shoulder, we want to be straight up and down from the bar, but the bar is a little bit behind your shoulder right now. So we want to be able to bring all of that back a little bit. So shift the weight back further towards your heels, but a wider stance and grip might be able to help you do that because you are a pretty big, tall guy. Next up from Zubair, he's doing some, doesn't mention in the email, he's doing some deadlifts here. So Zubair actually has pretty good technique overall. He's got a good setup. Most of his lift looks really solid, but you'll notice right before he gets to the knees, everything kind of pitches forward a little bit more than what I would recommend. Now, I think Zubair is trying really hard to get his knees locked first, which is a good cue, but in this case, I think it's being exaggerated a little bit much. So I think the amount of knee extension he's trying to get before he finishes the lift is actually pushing the bar out in front of him a little bit too much. So I would actually slow down the knees a little bit and lock them a half second, quarter second later. So a little bit more patience off the floor as well to maintain position. And then don't emphasize the knees first quite so much, Zubair. I think that'll help keep you in a much better position as you come across the knee. And that's gonna be important when you get up to bigger weights. Our next submission comes from a guy named Max Alper, and for some reason I recognize your name. I don't know why or where. I've heard it before, but you're a pretty strong guy. He said he pulled 300 kilos or 660 at about 198 or so, so very strong dude here. Now he notices that his biggest strength is that he's really quick off the floor, but he has a hard time locking out. So when we get past the knees, he ends up with a lot of hip extension he's having to go through, and probably a little bit of loss of positioning in the back. Now, if you watch Max's deadlift, as he initiates it, the hips rise up quite far and he ends up in a fairly stiff-legged position. So this would be the first thing I would try to work on, Max, is try to, there's really sort of two ends of the spectrum when you're talking about a conventional deadlift. There's a very stiff-legged deadlift and there's a very sort of more seated, quad-dominant kind of deadlift. So most people are going to be somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, and it's important to find an individual point on the spectrum where it's going to be ideal for your leverages and your strengths. Now, Max is very much towards the stiff-legged end of the spectrum, so what I would try to do is I would try to work with more of a sort of seated, quad-dominant kind of deadlift. Now, obviously, you don't want to get too far away from what's given you a lot of success as a deadlifter because you're quite strong, but I would think adding in some pause deadlifts, even some snatch grip deadlifts where you're forced to sit down a little bit more and not allow your butt to raise up behind you. Some things like that might help you get a little bit stronger through to your lockout based on, due to better positioning off the floor. So try to use your quads a little bit more, and as well try to maintain a little bit more of a neutral back angle. Because what's happening is, another reason that your lockout is struggling is because we're having to sort of smush the back through at the top and get back extension as opposed to just hip extension. Next up, we got a video from Ezra, and he's submitted a couple of videos of his deadlift. So Ezra's deadlift, he's got one failed attempt here and one nearly failed attempt. Now, the biggest thing I'm noticing is Ezra's having a really hard time keeping his knees out. Keeping his knees out over his toes, and as soon as he pulls it off the floor, you'll see the knees cave in a little bit, and he has a really hard time, especially towards lockout. So what I would imagine is also happening is we're losing that back angle. So biggest thing, I think, Ezra, practice some pause deadlifts, as well as making sure that you're keeping everything open. And when I say open, if you want to think about the shoulders rolling forward, knees rolling in, everything collapsing in towards the center point. This way is closed, the opposite would be open. And when we sumo deadlift, we very much want to keep everything open. So shoulders are sort of back and down to maintain some extension in the upper back and keep those shoulder blades low. And as well, we're making sure we're keeping the knees out in position, pointing over the toes and not allowing it to collapse. Another thing you could look at, Ezra, is your feet. So if your feet aren't sort of up like this and the ankle's collapsing, which generally goes hand in hand with that knee cave, we can look at trying to use the feet and stay on the arches a little bit better as well to maintain a bit of a better position off the floor. Next up, we have a video from Ashley Weeb. Now, she's doing some squats here. She says she's coached by Joey Franzo, but it's always nice to get another opinion. She says she struggles to find where her balance should be, and she's relying on her back more than her legs. Now, her squat actually looks a lot like my fiance's squat, and one of the biggest cues that helped Selena squat a little bit better, that might help you, Ashley, is to try and really focus on pulling the bar into your back with your lats. So really focusing on using the lats to stabilize the spine and to maintain a good position. Your squat really looks mostly ideal. Another thing that you do that Selena also does is we get a little bit of sort of knees pushing back and the hips coming back. You guys both have long torsos, long legs. So that can contribute to a lot to your back doing a lot of the work. So another thing that I would try to focus on is keeping the knees a little bit more forward, especially as you drive out of the hole, and using a little bit more quads. So big emphasis on keeping the lats so that we're stabilizing the back using the lats, which is going to be the strongest muscle available for that purpose, as well as making sure we're using the quads to stay a little bit more upright, because as soon as the knees come back, the hips come back, and the torso goes forward, which is going to cause a bit more strain on the back as well. All in all, squat looks really good. I know Joey's an incredible coach. He coaches John Hack, who's one of the best lifters out there right now. So definitely listen to your coach. Hopefully those couple of cues can help. Next up, we have some sumo deadlifts from Cam. And yes, so Cam is actually an example of something that I've been looking to try and find for a while. So I know as a coach and through these form checks and stuff, I preach a lot about extending your back in the sumo deadlift. Now, Cam has actually taken that cue and is extending his back too much. So he's going into what's called hyperextension. So there's sort of a natural amount of extension that your spine wants to sit in at a neutral level. Now, what Cam's doing is he's actually going past that to the point where things are hyperextended. Now, so what I would say for Cam is I would say to try and eliminate that, I want you to really think about locking your ribs down and keeping a more neutral pelvis position. So engaging your abs a little bit more to bridge the front of your body, almost like you're doing a plank or something. Now, the other thing that we're seeing is as Cam locks out, he goes from hyperextension back into, looks like neutral, maybe a little bit past neutral, might even be into flexion. So what I would try to do is I would try to get a lot less spine movement. So lock your back in a little bit better when you start, and don't sort of dump your hips under you when you lock out. You want to squeeze the glutes, but you don't want to allow your back to move as you lock out either. So let's try and get that back a little bit more neutral, a little bit more immobile, or a little bit less movement out of the back as you go through your deadlift. Lastly, we have another deadlift from Dennis Vu. And Dennis is experiencing a lot of the same issues as Ezra. He's starting to lose his back. It looks like we could lock the shoulder blades down quite a bit better. And as well, let's see if we can see his feet when he initiates the pull here. So yeah, it looks like, and you can see, maybe Dylan can even zoom in a little bit on that far foot, but you can see right as he starts to pull, the foot flattens out, the knee caves in, and a lot of things just kind of go wrong up the chain. So let's focus on those feet. Let's focus on staying open, keeping those lats pulled down. It looks like the shoulders are rolling forward pretty good right as you start your deadlift. So we can maintain a lot more of an upright torso if we can get those lats down and shoulder blades down, pulled down towards your butt. So let's try all those things. Focus on the feet first, and then just sort of move up the chain from there. Knees over toes, create a little bit more tension in your upper back and keep those shoulders from rolling forward. And that should help quite a bit, man. It also just looks like that's a pretty heavy, yeah, it says right here, it was a personal best. So sometimes when we lift heavy, things are gonna go a little bit wrong, and that's not always a bad thing when we're pushing for those sort of maximal weights. But we really want to try to cultivate the best technique that we can in training. So Dennis, I want you to try and use some of those cues in your next training session. That's it for us today, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you again next week.